Every person carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. If a deficiency is conscious, there is always a chance to correct it. But if it is repressed and separated from consciousness, it never gets corrected, and it can suddenly erupt at an unguarded moment. In any case, it forms an unconscious obstacle that thwarts our best intentions. Carl Jung speaks of two kinds of shadows: the personal shadow, the unknown dark side of our personality, and the collective shadow, the unknown dark side of society. Starting with the personal shadow, Jung calls it that which a person does not want to be. It represents the unknown or lesser-known traits and characteristics of the ego. It is the collection of all those undesirable qualities we prefer to hide from ourselves. The shadow consists of the inferiorities that everyone possesses but does not wish to acknowledge. They seem weak, socially unacceptable, or even evil. The shadow becomes most visible when a person is gripped by anxiety or other emotions, or under the influence of alcohol, etc. A person may suddenly throw a hostile remark during a friendly conversation. When we refuse to include the things we consider contemptible, we project them onto others. It is possible for someone to be aware of their shadow and to have partial conscious awareness of it, meaning under the control of the ego. However, many people reject their shadows so strongly that the ego is not even aware of the shadow's behavior, leaving no possibility of control. In such situations, the shadow becomes autonomous and may appear in incomprehensible moods, irritability, and cruelty. Jung repeatedly pointed out in his writings how important it is in psychotherapy to develop awareness of the shadow and to understand its projections in one's life. Although the shadow is usually considered negative, it can also be positive. In fact, discovering one's shadow gives us access to many positive qualities. Jung writes that the shadow displays a number of good qualities, such as normal instincts, appropriate reactions, realistic insights, creative impulses, and so forth. Jung's close associate Marie-Louise von Franz writes, "The shadow is not necessarily always an opponent. In fact, it is very much like a human being with whom one has to get along, sometimes bowing, sometimes resisting, sometimes giving love, as the situation requires. The shadow only becomes hostile when it is ignored or misunderstood." The shadow contains all sorts of characteristics, strengths, and abilities, which, if not revealed, create a poverty within our personality, forming unconscious obstacles that prevent the development and embodiment of those good qualities that lie dormant in our psyche. For example, a person may believe that being confident is rudeness or aggression, thus losing the ability to speak up for themselves with confidence and honesty. The result may be less initiative, difficulty in advancement or salary increase, financial struggles, etc. Thus, when a person encounters a confident individual, deep down they feel resentment and guilt, which makes their shadow darker and denser. These valuable aspects must be integrated into lived experience rather than repressed. It is up to the ego to let go of its egotism. We also meet our shadow in dreams, in the form of a person of the same sex as the dreamer. It is a kind of critique from the unconscious upon our personality, an inner judge that reproaches us, and the result is usually embarrassed silence. We must identify the contents of the shadow and integrate them into our personality. This is the process of shadow reality, also called shadow work. Here begins the painful and long process of self-education. A person has to enter into prolonged and difficult negotiations with the shadow, an endeavor we might call the psychological equivalent of the labors of Hercules. Through shadow work, one can view their shadow from the outside by observing their emotional reactions and being honest about their interactions with others, and from within by exploring their dreams. This enlightens a person and reduces the destructive potential of the shadow, not by fighting against the darkness, but by bringing darkness into light and light into darkness. As Jung writes, "There is no light without shadow, and no psychic wholeness without imperfection." We should not strive for perfection, but for wholeness of personality. This lifelong process of individual growth creates balance between the conscious and unconscious realms, harmonizing the ego with the self, that is, with the totality of the personality.
No matter how frightening or dark our shadow may be, finding the truth brings peace. To recognize the truth is in fact an act of sincerity, a painful excavation into the depths of one's being, a search for possibilities and limits, for distortions and those buried and often forgotten parts and potentials. Most people are so lazy that they do not even reflect deeply on their conscious moral habits, let alone consider how the unconscious affects them. The shadow may also consist of factors that come from sources outside an individual's personal life. This is when we encounter the collective shadow, the dark side of society and culture, the unknown or lesser-known aspects. It consists of those things that oppose our shared and collective values. The collective shadow points to a vast, multidimensional, and often terrifying yet obscure aspect of human life. The immense damage human beings inflict upon each other and upon nature, and the major effects this has on generations to come. We see the collective shadow in the projection of darkness and inferiority, in violence and oppression, in ignoring present suffering, in denial of present responsibility. Though the collective shadow may appear brutally in wars, massacres, and genocides, it can also hide behind attractive masks, such as missionary activities, for example, enforcing the use of specific languages, an Orwellian reality that we are experiencing in the present age. As with all shadow material, whether personal or collective, its existence and effects may be so vast that they are not immediately obvious. The collective shadow appears outwardly in oppression, physical torment, disease, poverty, food shortages, alcoholism, crime, the death of civilizations, and so on. It can also manifest inwardly in the complexities of every individual's psyche, as self-hatred, hatred of one's heritage and culture, depression and feelings of helplessness, the desire for revenge so that others may suffer the same pain, and so forth. The collective shadow is what has historically been called evil. In Christian tradition, it is the devil, and whoever falls under the devil's possession loses human qualities and takes on a demonic nature. According to Jung, our primary response to evil should be the pursuit of self-knowledge, of wholeness, which requires the integration of shadow material. An individual must relentlessly know how much good he can do and what crimes he is capable of. When a problem in society is well known, if there is evidence of denial, projection, and the refusal to take individual and collective responsibility, it can be called a shadow problem. Therefore, taking responsibility, morally, politically, and spiritually, is especially important. The courage with which we bear our own darkness relieves others of the burden of having to carry it for us. For example, when we see great historical sufferings such as wars, genocides, the Holocaust, total oppression, etc., whose effects are still present today, we as human beings have much to learn. Denial, often connected with the desire to move on and leave the past behind, is the most common attitude and usually the first reaction. Many attempts have been made and are being made to deal with the difficult and painful past, such as public apologies for supporting oppression, repentance, reparations after wars, pilgrimages to the sites of great torture chambers, and so on. But how should we deal with the past so that the integration of the shadow takes place deeply and widely across an entire population, and not remain merely at a symbolic level through leaders or policies? Remembering and speaking what often seems unspeakable is inevitably a painful process for victims and oppressors alike, for bystanders and witnesses too. Such a process can only be called successful or relatively complete when pain, anger, betrayal, grief, and all other emotions are expressed and heard, and when responsibility is accepted. Speaking the truth is the most desirable and most workable way of dealing with a difficult past. A terrifying example of the collective shadow is Nazi Germany, where people, through their personal shadow, fell into a demonic nature. They joined the Nazi Party and committed acts they could never have imagined or ever done under normal circumstances. In this sense, the personal shadow is a bridge to the collective shadow. Therefore, it is necessary to resolve one's inner conflicts, personal shadow, first, so that one does not unconsciously fall into the collective shadow. Then one can influence others, and the whole society can become better. If we act consciously, we will be able to look deeply into the nature of war and with our insight awaken people so that together we may prevent the repetition of such horrific events. War is within us, but also within everyone else. Everything is ready to explode, and we are all co-responsible. In summary, we must first acknowledge our personal shadow and enter into long and difficult negotiations with it, being honest with ourselves and with others, observing our emotional reactions, and exploring our dreams, so that we do not become helpless victims of our shadow and our unconscious projections, and so that we may recover those good qualities that lie dormant within us, which improve our own life and the lives of those around us. Then we can consciously become aware of the collective shadow and not fall prey to it, and take responsibility for overcoming denial and the lack of individual and collective action on important issues. The courage with which we bear our own darkness relieves others of the burden of having to carry it for us. Speaking the truth is the most desirable and most workable way of dealing with a difficult past, rather than ignoring the atrocities and letting the shadow grow darker until it can no longer be contained, and then history repeats itself. I hope you enjoyed this video. You can support the channel on Patreon or by liking, commenting, or sharing. Thank you for watching.